The member for Waite.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. And, sir, can I congratulate you on your election to this position as Speaker of the House, and look forward to your deliberations in a fair and even-handed manner. So congratulations. Sir, as indicated, I also rise to make a few remarks in relation to this bill and to sort of provide a bit of an update to the House of some of the concerns that have been expressed to me via my community. And of course, we all know that COVID has had a profound impact on our lives, from the most basic gesture of shaking of a hand to the bridal waltz, to the more complicated social and economic ramifications that have been imposed upon us by this virus. And I think we can all agree that the people of South Australia have been model citizens in the way that they have gone about dealing with this crisis. Can I, as both the Attorney and the Lead Speaker of the Opposition have indicated, my thanks to those frontline workers, to people in SA Health who are going above and beyond what they expect in their normal roles, in the way they are doing so well in community contact tracing, which is, I think, why we are doing so well here in South Australia, and of course to the way they're doing their community testing as well, to SAPOL, who have had considerable resources diverted from their day-to-day role in policing in South Australia to spending time on borders and ensuring that South Australians comply with many of the measures and directions that are given to them, and quite often changing across a matter of days and weeks. And of course, we saw that around the hard border lockdown a couple of weeks ago between South Australia and Victoria, and the way that affected many of those border communities. And of course businesses as well, who've had to comply with ever-changing regulations, and I thank them for doing their very best, especially our small businesses in our suburban communities, in our cafes and restaurants and retail shops. It's very hard to keep abreast of the changing regulations and rules, to doing their very best to comply. Obviously we saw reports from the weekend where the Glenelg Footy Club received a fine for failing to comply with some of the COVID restrictions, and that's a real shame, because I've got no doubt they had best endeavours to do the right thing, but it's the nature of the beast that we're dealing with. I think for us as lawmakers, we do have a difficult challenge in ensuring that the legislation that we debate, ultimately that we pass, to give powers, or extraordinary powers as we have under the Emergency Management Act, protects both our citizens' health and equal of importance civil liberties, and of course the role that the state plays in underpinning our economy at this time. And I think significant thanks has to go to the federal Morrison government for JobKeeper and JobSeeker for ensuring that there is continuity and calmness, especially in the jobs market. This virus has no foreseeable end in sight, which means our laws must marry up, I believe, with unforeseen implications. In recent days, we have seen and heard much commentary in relation to the Victorian hard lockdown and the Andrews government's desire to eliminate COVID, and what many would regard as the erosion of civil liberties in the state of Victoria, and I think that is concern to many people across the country. For me, most concerning recently was the arrest of a pregnant lady in Ballarat for allegedly planning a protest. So the right to assemble and freedom of expression are core human rights and essential freedoms that all sides of politics rely on to ensure we can work improving the quality of life for all. And indeed, in the Australian today, I think there was a very good opinion piece by a Melburnian who fled to Australia in 1981 from Poland, which of course at the time was going through martial law. And
member for Waite, I wondered, does the member for Waite wish to seek leave to continue his remarks?
Mr. Speaker, I seek leave to continue my remarks.
Leave sought is on his feet. You have the call.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. And before the suspension of the House, I was talking about rights and freedoms and referring to an article in the Australian today by Jack Mordez, who talks about how martial law restrictions were enacted by General Jaruzelski in 1981 in Poland. And he goes on to say, the restrictions are oddly similar to those in Victoria living under Daniel Andrews' rule 4 decades on. He goes, there was a 10 p.m. curfew with police patrols enforcing zero tolerance, borders were closed, movement between cities and regions were prohibited unless you carried a special permit, classes in schools and universities were suspended, telephone communications were monitored, opposition activists were arrested, many without charge. The police, called the militia, became the arm of government. To many Victorians, this is certainly what they're feeling at the moment. And I think it's really important for all members of Parliament across our beautiful country to really think about what's happening in our society at the moment as we grapple with this health pandemic, this economic crisis that we now have. And of course, we're now, as a nation, in recession, which is for so many Australians the first time they've ever experienced that in their lifetimes. And I seriously struggle to understand how a government in this nation can allow protests on one issue during the middle of a pandemic, but now arresting citizens for planning protests organised in protection of our most basic civil rights as they are in Victoria. So South Australians, and indeed all Australians, want to do the right thing during this pandemic. Unfortunately, we too often see a double standard in terms of rights and privileges. Most recently, the AFL elite flew to Queensland to announce that the AFL Grand Final will be played at the Gabba, but a pregnant woman from Ballina couldn't travel 100 kilometres to Queensland for medical attention, and because of that she lost her unborn child. Undoubtedly, we have all received a considerable amount of correspondence from our constituents with stories of their struggles coping with COVID-19, especially those who are stuck in Victoria, and I know this is the case for many of our border communities and MPs. My office is no different, and I would like to share with the House some of the frustrations of my constituents in trying to, as they try to go about sensibly navigating the COVID world. And I'd like to begin with the example of Mr and Mrs Pollard of Hawthorne Dean, who are constituents aged in their 70s. They travelled interstate from South Australia to Victoria to attend a funeral. As regulations changed, returning home became quite the ordeal. When attempting to return home, SA Health offered the couple an ultimatum: either continue their indefinite self-funded stay in Victoria or accept the price to self-fund hotel quarantine in South Australia. Mr and Mrs Pollard certainly did not feel that they had a choice, and there are a number of issues I want to raise in relation to that. Firstly, this law-abiding couple could have easily self-quarantined at home, and a question of many is why the need to quarantine in a hotel, especially at a cost of $4,000. They felt a greater risk to the virus was upon them when being forced to quarantine at a hotel where potential COVID cases were isolated with numerous different people and staff visiting on a daily basis. And we've certainly seen the failure in Victoria of hotel quarantine. After this couple indeed saw that saga, and for them, they certainly felt that it would make more sense for them to be isolating at home. For 3 months, these residents and their family were under immense stress as they were in Victoria. On a daily basis, they were not sleeping and were concerned about the impact of their physical and mental health, to the point where they thought they were a high chance of becoming infected and dying because they were in Victoria. To their avail, they had themselves tested on multiple occasions, resulting in negative returns. Unfortunately, their story gets worse. After finally receiving exemption from South Australia and deciding to inherit the costs of that return, they embarked on their journey back to South Australia. When they left Melbourne, instead of a simple direct drive home, prepared to not need to refuel in South Australia and return directly to quarantine, that would not involve contact with anyone in SA, the following prevailed. And I will now read the story from the Pollards, and I quote, "We booked to cross at Penola, the nearest approved crossing to Torquay, at 2 p.m. on Saturday. Unfortunately, we received no contact details or confirmation email. We left Torquay around 9:15 a.m. on Saturday, and plenty of time to be at Penola crossing by 2 p.m. Just out of Hamilton at 11:15 a.m, we received a call checking on our progress. We said we were doing well and we would be at Penola before 2 p.m. Then the bombshell dropped. We could not cross at Penola and would have to be at Bordertown by 2 p.m. or be in the next convoy leaving at 10 a.m. on Sunday. We said we didn't know if we could make it and we would call back. Panic. After a hectic check of Google Maps, we got an ETA of about 2:45 to Bordertown. Then followed a hectic and stressful drive through Western Victoria. We arrived at the border just before 2:30 p.m. Adelaide time after driving without a break apart from toilet stops for nearly 6 hours. When we arrived at Tailem Bend, our escort changed. Due to our advanced age, both Chris and I were desperate in need of a toilet stop. We were told we couldn't use public facilities and we could hang on for another hour. We were opposite the golf course and asked if we could find a tree there. We were escorted across the road by a female officer, a great way to treat a 75-year-old lady. When we arrived at the Adelaide Hotel, they tried to get us to the room as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, we were escorted to the wrong car park. After unloading the car, we had to repack and had to pay the $8 to get out of the car park. Eventually, we made it to our room. Unbelievably, we received a phone call from SAPO officer the next morning. He was at our home and we weren't there as required. We told him we were in quarantine in the Pullman. And Ms Pollard makes some recommendations that I believe might be simple, and indeed simple, but of course requires resourcing from the government. And she says all returning travellers to be given a single SA Health contact person and all arrangements are confirmed by email. Appropriate arrangements are made in place, and I think she's referring to the toilet need of travellers, and stops are made every 2 hours. I would take this further to say that we do not need even to have such strict measures, and I think there are plenty of sensible individuals who are able to isolate. Of course, there is a lot of paperwork, and I know that there's a lot of stress placed on SA Health workers and indeed SAPOL in monitoring these restrictions that we have in place. But we need to allow common sense to prevail quite often, and allow those who are making these decisions on the ground to have common sense prevail as well, and the simple ability to allow a person, any person, to be able to relieve themselves when driving back from Melbourne to South Australia seems like a very logical one. But once again, I think we forget that we get caught up in bureaucracy. Another story I'd like to share is of my constituent, Mr Jukovic, and his wife, who applied to move to South Australia permanently on July 10, 2020. Mrs Jukovic is originally from South Australia, and many of their family and friends still live here. Based on the rulings at the time, they accepted and had to accept a new lease for a property in Kingswood, and gave notice to their home in Richmond, Victoria, to prove the legitimacy of their intentions. Mr Jukovic also registered for his first semester of CPA Australia and booked exams in Adelaide whilst his wife was transferred to the Telstra team in Adelaide. And it's great to see some Victorians choosing to live in South Australia. And indeed, why wouldn't you want to live in South Australia? After a lengthy administrative ordeals, jumping through all the hoops, with days between correspondence from SA Health, on July 30 at 10 p.m, they received approval. Then, after making significant plans and booking removalists, they surprisingly somehow received a decline for their application on July 31st at 12 p.m. Despite best efforts in contacting many departments, no one could verify which notice was correct. Mr Jukovic and his wife had packed and planned for their whole life to move to South Australia, were now in disarray. Mr Jukovic and his wife had both been cleared of COVID, ticked every box in the application, and emphasised measures to strictly social distance and self-quarantine. Why was his family denied entry into our state? I'm not sure. What message does this send to other families considering moving to South Australia? For a state that needs significant population growth, this is not a good look in my opinion. We should be encouraging population growth, not limiting it, and I say we should be opening up the door to many, especially South Australians who have sought to create life in Victoria and other parts of Australia, to indeed come back to this wonderful state that we have here. And there's a multitude of other stories in terms of what I've received in my community. There was Heidi Reeson, a mother of four who's lived and worked and volunteered in Australia for 40 years, who has a daughter stuck in Germany and can't come to Australia. There is Mr Kim Dreisner, who's trying to maintain his business, JK Race Trailers, during these difficult times. And of course, is one of the businesses that quite regularly needs to travel to Victoria to collect stock for his trailer business. Unfortunately, because of the difficulty with so many of the exemptions and permits, his business has been shut since April. And the question that many of us ask, and I think there are legitimate questions, is with very little active cases of COVID in South Australia, and indeed we've done a magnificent job in flattening the curve, what is the end game and what are we trying to achieve? We have We have very strong restrictions, but at some point I think we need to start having a debate about what does life look like if COVID is here to stay. We don't know where a vaccine is gone and when it's going to come. There was discussions on the news last night on the ABC about, successful vaccine trials take many, many years, and there's debate all around the world happening about what does a vaccine look like if it comes in the next 12 months. And I think we need to have a conversation as a parliament, as a state, about what does long-term living with COVID in society look like. I think we can see that the Victorian case of trying to eliminate to zero isn't working. The New South Wales government, certainly the way they've been doing their tracing, seems to be a much better model to being adopting. But we have seen stress on business, we have stress on individuals, we're seeing plenty of stress on family. And the way we're dealing with COVID is leading to events being cancelled that bring such joy to us: sport, theatre, the arts, the Christmas pageant. And this is all happening at a time when there are little or no cases in South Australia. So indeed the question always needs to be asked, what are the costs of these restrictions? We've seen a scourge of isolation and loneliness, with calls to Lifeline increasing by 20% during the first lockdown. Unemployment and underemployment are at all-time high, with over 70,000 South Australians reportedly being unemployed. And what is that going to look like when JobKeeper and JobSeeker eventually run out? We have seen the worst quarterly reduction in GDP on record, and expected a $1.85 billion projected fall in SA's GST revenue over the next 2 years. As the Library of Economics and Liberty has recently stated, the cost of this national shutdown are growing by the hour, and we don't mean federal spending. We mean a tsunami of economic destruction that will cause tens of millions to lose their jobs as commerce and production simply ceases. Many large companies can withstand a few weeks without revenue, but this isn't true of the millions of small and medium-sized firms. And indeed, that is exactly what South Australia is, as a small and medium-sized economy. While the road to recovery is not an easy task, we need to carefully consider both individuals and businesses when we are planning the new normal. We need to consider how this pandemic has impacted a number of policy areas, from operating a small business to reductions in public transport, and very seriously the basic protection of our privacy. And on this note, there was another constituent who raised with me, Dr Moxham, about the way our COVID registration sheets are and the need to trace are held and what security measures are around. So when people enter venues, and indeed they have to write down their names and for contact tracing purposes, at the end of the day, who actually protects that data, and are all organisations complying with the federal government's Australian privacy provisions. I believe South Australia should lead an effort with other states in terms of focusing on strategies on treatment rather than suppression and containment of COVID, which is so important. And according to the Oxford University's Stringency Index, Victorians have been under one of the most harsh and long-lasting restrictions since mid-March, with grim prospects of success due to a staged reopening pinned to daily cases falling between fortnightly figures. South Australia must not get caught in this trap, and quite grateful that I don't think we are. But businesses and people in South Australia are signalling a desire for the state to get back to new normal. As Professor Fisher has indicated, and he's the chair of the WHO Outbreak Alert and Response Network, says, targets as roadmaps are incredibly community empowering. It is really up to the community. The governments can't do everything in terms of a road back. And that's why I'll be foreshadowing that I'll be supporting the member for Frome's amendment to see in this legislation the deadline for these measures to expire at 31 December, as opposed to flagged as 28 March 2021. Because I think it's really important that constantly the public are given a roadmap and expectation setting about what is needed. And as I've said in this contribution, Parliament is, the primacy of Parliament is most important, and I don't think it hurts for the Parliament to come back regularly and reflect on the laws that it passes and the powers that it gives. And for the Parliament to extend the Emergency Management Act for a further 3 months, I believe is prudent, more so than 6, and we can come back to this House in December and reflect on where we are, and by all means, if an additional 3 months is required, in terms of the extension of the Emergency Management Act. We should be doing that, but Parliament should be, as always, given the opportunity to provide scrutiny to all actions of the Executive, because that is indeed what we are here for.
Any further